this year in Windsor, we're going to be using a set of 4 strategies that are designed to support the literacy development of adolescents specifically in middle and high school across all of their content areas. So the purpose of this video is to give a quick overview of each of the 4 strategies that we're going to be using this year. An idea of when we're going to be introducing and trying out and building on each one across the year. And also a sense of where these strategies came from and why these 4 were selected as the 4 we're really going to invest in together this year to collaborate on and try out and refine so that we have this core set of 4 strategies that we all really know and use across all of the content areas and grades in the middle and high school together. So the first strategy that we're going to be talking about today, and the first that we're going to be talking about this year, is the idea of setting really clear task parameters. And this is a great place to start at the beginning of the year with the idea that we know purpose makes such a big difference in students' ability to understand what they're reading and their ability to communicate effectively in writing. So if they have a purpose for reading and a purpose for writing, they have much greater engagement and they have much better achievement. And so this idea of setting clear task parameters that really communicate to students what they're doing and why they're doing it as readers and writers is an investment in that lever of purpose for supporting kids as readers and writers. The next strategy that we're going to be thinking about is really a strategy around vocabulary. And so this idea that words exist in networks in our minds and also in the world, that words are connected to other words, are connected to meanings and synonyms and other words and concepts that float around them and make up sort of the 3D world of a word. And so when we teach vocabulary, it's not enough to sort of have kids memorize a word and its definition. We want to really make sure that they are remembering that word and creating connections and pathways to that word so that they don't just retain it, but they actually remember it and use it. So they can retrieve the word when they want to, so that they are using it strategically in different contexts, and so that if we really invest the time in some particular target vocabulary words for our content area or for a text that we're reading, that students not only remember them, but keep them forever and use them. So we have a strategy around creating these networks of understanding for words that is in support of vocabulary development. At the top, we have this idea about text sets and some strategies around creating multiple pathways in for students to find their way into a concept or a skill or strategy that you're teaching in class. So making sure that they see multiple representations, that they can choose the way that they interact with those ideas, that they feel that they have agency and can see themselves doing the tasks that you put in front of them. And one of the ways that we can really invest in that power of choice for students and invest in the differences, the individual differences that they all bring, and use those as an asset, is to create sets of material around text that provide different pathways in. At the end of the year, we're going to turn to this idea of text-dependent talk. And like a text-dependent question, text-dependent talk simply means talking about the text that you read and the text that you write. We know that talk presents an amazing opportunity for students to process. That simply the change in modality from written to spoken, or from read visually to spoken verbally, creates stronger connections to the material and also allows students to process and extend and innovate ideas that they wouldn't necessarily have done if they only read and then didn't talk about it, or only wrote but then didn't talk about their writing. So really giving them a chance to extend what they know about reading and writing as processes, and also extend what they know about whatever they're reading and writing about by having these structured opportunities to talk about the text they interact with. So I want to give a little bit of background on how these 4 strategies were selected. And we started with these 3 design principles. And the design principles are drawn from research on adolescent development and adolescent literacy development specifically. But you probably will recognize them from even just pop culture representations of what we know about adolescents. That adolescents like to have their own agency and independence. They like to be social beings. And they like to feel competent when they are trying new things or when they are performing tasks that they've performed before. And so we started with this first design principle of choice, and really thinking that we know when students have a choice about what they're doing or when they have a choice about how they accomplish what you've set out for them to do, that they feel a greater sense of ownership, they have greater confidence to attempt that task. And so we wanted to make sure that whatever strategies we selected, that they were strategies that'll really let teachers open up choices and invest in the power of choice to engage and support students. So choice is one of the things that we looked for when we were selecting the strategies. The second one has everything to do with adolescents being social beings, and we want to capitalize on that and make that an asset instead of something that might distract from learning. So we thought a lot about connection, and literacy is, if nothing else, a social activity. We read and write to communicate with each other, and we don't read and write in a vacuum to communicate with no one. And so if literacy is all about connection, then our instruction around literate activities like reading, writing, and talking need to focus on connection too, connections between ideas, connections within a language, but also connecting what we're reading to other texts, connecting text to certain activities or certain realities that exist in the world, and connecting our processes of writing and of reading to the different things that reading and writing let us do. So we thought a lot about connection when we were selecting these strategies, making sure that these 4 strategies we use this year are all about inviting connection and reinforcing connection for our adolescent learners. And then finally, we thought about the need for thinking to be made visible for adolescents. We're no longer sort of teaching them how to be in school. We want to teach them how to use school to learn the things they want to know as adults and as more and more active members of a community or a career community or a family community. So we want to make sure that it's not just magical seeming to students, that some students understand novels and some students don't, or like some students magically solve math problems and some students don't. It shouldn't be left to chance who gets to understand and make sense of the things that we talk about all throughout the school day. It should be very clear to students how to approach and how to try and how to persist with the processes that lead to success in each of their different content area classes. So we really wanted to invest in strategies that made the teacher's thinking process visible, that help students make their own thinking process visible and accessible to each other, so that we're really focusing on how to accomplish different goals in our content areas. Not on memorizing stuff, but on learning how to engage in the practices and the processes that support our using that information out in the world and in our school community. So we started with these 3 design principles, but we also wanted to really make sure that the strategies we chose were grounded in a research base we could depend on, and also a theoretical base with really deep roots in what we know about adolescence and what we know about literacy development and education in general. And so we reached for inspiration and we reached for confirmation that these were good choices from a couple of documents that you're very familiar with. And so you probably will notice that there are echoes of things you've heard before throughout this presentation, and that's a good thing. We're not trying to be original. We're trying to sort of pull the best of what we know and come together around those strategies because we know that they're going to be good for kids. So one place that we started off was a document that explains how we can design instruction that is universally accessible. So we started with the Universal Design for Learning principles. And from those principles, we really drew on those ideas around multiple forms of representation, multiple ways of representing content, multiple pathways for knowing things, so that different kinds of learners and different kinds of content can be accessible in multiple ways, that we're not limiting to one kind of learner, and we're not limiting to one way of representing what it is that you know. The other place that we went was the standards documents, and we used both the Common Core State standards and also the National Professional Organization standards for each of the different content areas that have them. We wanted to make sure that we weren't erasing content area boundaries or assuming that teaching science is the same as teaching social studies, which is the same as teaching art, that there are important differences and contrasts in what you're teaching and how you're teaching it. And we wanted to be sensitive to those. So we wanted to find places where there was overlap and places of sort of synergy between the standards of all of the different content areas where our goals intersect, where the ways that we could use text or have students interact with the text that come with our content area are similar enough that these strategies would help. Because the last thing that we want is for people to stop teaching their content to teach literacy strategies instead. So we wanted to make sure we were choosing literacy strategies that complement and support and make way for content. And so we had to go to the standards of each of the content areas individually, and also to the CCSS, that is something that many of our content areas share in common, in order to make sure that these strategies we present support the work of doing content area learning and don't take away from it. And the last place that we looked, it was actually a series of documents around this idea that is more and more prevalent, that there are a certain set of high leverage practices that teachers might engage with a whole slew of different practices. And one of the things that lets us be individual as educators is we might engage in those practices differently, we might make up new practices, but that there are a certain set of reliable, high leverage practices that are generalizable, that we can use and revise and refine in each of the different content areas. So we really wanted to find strategies that had enough research evidence that we knew they were high leverage. If we do these strategies, we can expect a good result because we've seen it happen before. And also high leverage in that they're high utility. They will come up as useful and they will be able to be integrated frequently. They'll support content learning not just once a year, but all the time in an ongoing way. And so we looked at the literature on high leverage practices and examples of high leverage practices from the University of Michigan. Marzano has a list. We looked at several other lists of high leverage practices too, and looked for strategies that either were referenced on these lists or really resonated with practices that are on that list, so that we know if we do each engage in the 4 strategies that we're talking about this year, we know that we can expect good results for students.